So you want to be a web developer, but you're a bit overwhelmed with, well, everything. Well, that's understandable, and in fact, most of us have been in your shoes. Hi there, my name is Jeremy McPeak, and in this course I will help you understand the things you need to know to get started as a web developer. First, I'm going to walk you through the tools you'll need for not only this course, but for your journey as a web developer. We live in a fantastic time where tools are plentiful, and it can actually be difficult to find the tool that we love to use. Next, I'll give you an overview of how the internet works. It's really nothing more than a huge network, but a lot of technologies work together behind the scenes in order to make it function. Then I'll introduce you to the 3 technologies we use that work together to make great web pages. First is HTML, the language we use to create the foundation of our web pages. Without HTML, our pages would be a jumbled mess of text. HTML allows us to give our pages structure, and it also gives us the ability to give certain text within our page a specific meaning. But HTML is a limited language. We use it only for marking up our documents. In order to give our pages a pleasing look, we use cascading style sheets, or CSS. With CSS, we select certain pieces of our web page in order to change how it looks. We can even change the layout of our page. The third technology is a language called JavaScript, and it's what we use to energize our web pages. With JavaScript, we can change our pages on the fly, even go so far as to remove and add new pieces to the page. We can also change the CSS with JavaScript too. We have a lot of ground to cover, so when you're ready, cue up the first video and we will get started. Web developers use a lot of tools for writing their sites and applications, and we're not going to cover the vast majority of them because while they solve some very complex problems, they also introduce a lot of complexity. You're just starting out, so you don't need to know all of that stuff. Instead, we're going to cover the most basic tools that you will need, not just for this course, but for everything else that you're going to do as a web developer. So starting today, these are tools that you are going to be using every day, if this is something that you do every day. We're going to start with the most obvious, and that is a browser. You need to download and install a browser. Now, every operating system has one already installed, but you should know that the browser is where our sites and applications execute. So in that sense, it's a lot like an operating system. And just like all of the other operating systems in the world, every browser is different. Chrome, IE, Edge, Firefox, all of these browsers, while they have some commonality, they also have some differences. Some browsers support features and technologies that other browsers do not. Now, the very best web developers write their sites and applications to run in every browser, and that is something that you definitely want to work towards. But for the sake of simplicity, and for just starting out, we're going to stick with just one browser. Now, it really doesn't matter what browser you choose, because for everything that we're going to talk about in this course, every modern browser is going to work just fine. However, I am going to use Google Chrome. It is cross-platform, which is of course very good, but it's also our go-to browser. Anytime that we need to quickly test something, or even as we are developing our site or application, we typically just have one browser open because that just greatly simplifies the development process. And then as we need to start testing in other browsers, then we incorporate those. And Chrome is that browser that we use. It is essentially the de facto standard as far as browsers are concerned today. So browser is the first tool that you will need. The second is a text editor because we're going to be working with a lot of text. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, these are all programming languages and we deal with them in text. Now, every operating system has a built-in text editor, but you do not want to use them. They will work, but they don't have a lot of the features that we need for editing code because that is what we are editing. Code is text, but code is special text. So I have replaced Notepad, which is the default text editor for Windows, with a program called Notepad 2. It has a lot of extra features like line numbers, which is very useful. There's also a feature called color coding. As we are writing code, there are special things in code that makes it different from normal text. So those are in a different color, and you begin to recognize what things are based upon their color. And every code editor is going to have these two things, line numbers and color coding. And there's, of course, other features that make code editors useful. And there are many code editors. A lot of them are free, and a lot of them are paid for software. So really what you need to do is find a code editor that you like. No one can tell you what the best one is except you. So I'm going to point you in the direction of several code editors, and I encourage you to try them all just so that you can get an idea of how they work and what you like in a code editor. We're going to start with a tool called brackets, and this is what I'm going to be using in this course because this also has the third tool that we need for web development, and that is a web server. Because while we can work with our files on the computer and run them from the computer, we really need to run our application from a web server. And brackets makes it easy to run the things that we are working with as a web server. So brackets.io, this is made by Adobe, but it is open source. It's also cross-platform. In fact, everything that I'm going to show you today is cross-platform. So you will be able to run it in Windows, OS X, and Linux. So download and install brackets, try it out, and of course right now you don't really know how to try it out, and that's okay. But I encourage you to use brackets as you are following along in this course because that is what I'm going to be using. So brackets is one option. There's another called Atom. If you go to atom.io, this is another code editor made by a company called GitHub, and it has a lot of the same features as brackets. But it too is cross-platform, it is open source, at least I think it's open source. But even if it's not, it's another wonderful tool that you can use for writing code. The third is made by Microsoft. If you go to visualstudio.com, they have a tool called Visual Studio Code. Now, if you are on Windows, you can install Visual Studio Community. However, if you're just now starting out, I recommend that you do not use Visual Studio. That is primarily for people who are familiar with not just web development, but development in general. But Visual Studio is a wonderful tool if you are on Windows. Now, they have something called Visual Studio Code, which is cross-platform, and it's a lot like Brackets and Atom. In fact, judging just by the screenshots that you see, they are a lot alike. The only thing about code, while I do like it, it is primarily geared for more experienced developers, especially those who are getting into the server side of things. So while you can use code, at this point in time, I don't recommend it to start out with, but do download it, take it for a test drive, because there are a lot of wonderful tools inside of Visual Studio Code. Now, the final tool that I'm going to show you is not free. It is cross-platform, and it's called Sublime Text. And you know, a lot of people balk about paying for software, but also remember that if this is something that you are serious about, you do need to spend the money on the tools that you want to use, the tools that are useful to you. If Sublime Text is one of those tools, then fork out the money for it. It's not very expensive. It used to be about $60, and it might be more than that now. But if it has the tools that you need later on down the road, then yes, give them the money because they have spent a lot of time on this. The current version is version 2, but they have version 3 in beta. And you can use the beta if you are a paid customer for version 2. Now, any one of these is going to serve you well. But once again, I'm going to be using brackets in this course. So what I would recommend for you right now is to install brackets, go through the course, and then as you are more familiar with web development in general, then download the other options and see which one you like better, and then start using that. Because the code editor is probably the most important tool that you are going to use. It is what you will use to create the sites and applications that you and other people are going to use. You need to love the tool that you will use every day. The internet is a conglomeration of many technologies that work together. And later in this course, we're going to look at 3 of those in more detail: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These are languages that we use to create web pages and use them as the front end for our web applications. But before we get into that, let's first dig into some of the more technical aspects of the internet, starting with what is the internet? Well, really, it's just one gigantic network, and I guess it would be more correct to say that it is a network of networks. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I am sitting in front of a computer in my home on my own personal network. So I have this computer and I have a few others and devices so that they can all talk to one another. And they are protected from any outside interference due to my router, because it has a built-in firewall, and it blocks any time anybody tries to intrude onto my personal network. However, all of my devices need to get out to the internet for some reason. They need to go to websites or contact services or things like that. So in order to do that, they have to go through the router, which is our gateway. They go through the router, and then that traffic is just sent wherever it needs to go. So the router is a piece of equipment that essentially joins one network with another. So really, my personal network is on the internet. If it didn't actively block people from just intruding, then people would be able to access the computers and devices that I have on my network. Now, in order to get onto a network, you need to have what's called an IP address. It is a unique number that is assigned to each computer and device on a given network. So I have, I don't know how many devices, and each one has an IP address, and they are all unique. Otherwise, they would not be able to get onto, first of all, the network and contact the other computers and devices, and they also would not be able to get out onto the internet. So I'm going to run a command called ipconfig. On Windows, this shows the IP configuration. Now, IP stands for Internet Protocol. And what I want to focus on is this IPv4 address. We have 2 types of IP addresses. We have IP4 and IP6. IP4 is an older addressing scheme. However, it is still used, especially with internal networks. And then IP6 is a newer IP scheme that is a lot more complex than IP4. Now, you can see here that my IP address for this machine is 192.168.0.114. Each of these numbers that are separated by dots are called octets. And if another computer or device on my network wanted to contact this machine, it would do so by sending information to this IP address. And if this machine wants to get out onto the internet, it has to go through this default gateway, that is my router, and that is 192.168.0.220. Now up here you can see IPv6, and you see that there are colons, and then there are hexadecimal values in between the colons. There's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sets of hexadecimal numbers. So it is much more complex, but it also allows for a lot of devices and computers on the network. Right now, the internet uses IP6. Although it still uses IP4, IP6 is the new standard. So everything on a network has to have an IP address. Otherwise, you would not be able to access that computer or device. For example, we are going to ping, that is, we are going to send a packet of data to a computer on the internet. So this is not going to be on my internal network. The IP address is 216.58.218.142. Now, whenever you ping something, you're basically wanting to check if you can access that resource. It could be a computer, it could be a router, it could be some other network appliance. So by sending a ping, we are essentially wondering if something is there. So that packet of data is going to be sent to that IP address. If there is something there, it is going to see that we are pinging it, and it is going to send a response saying, yeah, I'm here. And so it will do that 4 times. And we see that we have 4 replies. We also see the amount of time it took for the ping to go from our computer to the computer at this IP address and then back. So this was 34 milliseconds for the first ping, 40 milliseconds for the second, 36 for the third, and then 38 for the fourth. And that's pretty fast. Now this actually happens to be a website, but not every IP address that's on the internet will take you to a website. That just means that there is something at that IP address. It could be listening for people wanting to view a web page, or it could be something more specific. It could be listening as a web service, so that like a mobile app could send data to an IP address, and the computer at that IP address would be looking for something specific in order to respond to it. But in our case, we're going to go to the browser, we're going to type 216.58.218.142, and we are going to see that it takes us to google.com. So we can type in that IP address and go to Google, and that would work. I mean, obviously it does work. However, we don't want to have to memorize an IP address. That's something that we just don't want to do, especially with IP6 addresses. So instead, we have domain names, like google.com is a domain name. And that means that there has to be a system that maps a domain name to the IP address. So if we go back to the console, and if we type ping google.com, we're going to see that it goes to the same IP address. But in order to find the IP address for google.com, it had to look up to a gigantic database of domain names and their IP addresses. That's called DNS. It stands for Domain Name System. So whenever you want to go to any website, your computer has to first contact what's called a DNS server. The purpose of this server is to give your computer the IP address for the domain that you are wanting to access. And then your computer can then go to that IP address. So I'm going to go back to my console and I'm going to run ipconfig again, but I'm going to use the all option. This is going to list all of the settings for my IP configuration. What I want to focus on is the list of DNS servers. Now, I have several. The first is one on my local network, but then I have two others, and these are supplied by my ISP. And yours would be very similar to this. You probably wouldn't have a DNS on your local network. Well, you might. It just really depends upon how your network is set up. But you would definitely have the DNS servers for your ISP. Those servers will give you the IP address for that domain, and then your computer will go to that IP address. But how is DNS configured? Well, that really depends as well. I use a service called DNS Simple because DNS can be a rather complex topic, and DNS Simple just makes it easy to do. There are several records for DNS. And we're not going to really go over any of those. But here is a record of type A. And we can see that the name is McPeak.io. And then the IP address is 213.101.180.75. Now, this is one of those IP addresses that will not take us to the actual website. If we go here, we see that we have an error. And the reason is because of how Azure, which is Microsoft's cloud service, handles websites. But if we go to McPeak.io, it's going to look somewhat similar, but this is actually the page for McPeak.io. I haven't done anything with this domain, but this is active and it does work. So for the DNS of my domain, I had to link the domain name to the IP address. And there's a few other things that I had to set up for Azure's service. So that is how our computers get to resources that are out on the internet. More specifically, they are how they get to the computers that are serving websites. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at web servers and how they work. In this lesson, I want you to open up a browser and go to any website. I am going to open up Microsoft Edge and use it for the first few minutes because Google Chrome eliminates some of the things from the address bar that I want to point out here. Now, if you're like me, you typically don't do a search and then pick whatever website that you want to go to if you know what that website is. Like if I want to go to tutsplus.com, I just type www.tutsplus.com and then that takes me there. Now, in the previous lesson, we learned about DNS, where the domain name is translated into an IP address so that our computer can then go to wherever it needs to go. And all of that is related to the internet. Well, in this lesson, we're going to focus on the web-centric technologies. Now, a lot of people will say that the internet and the web are one and the same, but really they're not. The internet is just a network. We can put computers and devices all on the internet, and we can access them without going to an actual web page. The web, on the other hand, is nothing but web pages. Well, that's not correct. There are other what we call resources. Now, that is a key term, because what we see here, this entire thing in the address bar, is called a Universal Resource Locator, or URL. It is simply an address that we use to go to a resource on the web. Now, what is a resource? It can be a web page, it can be an image, or some other type of file. It's really anything that we can access using HTTP. That stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And every website that you go to uses HTTP. That is what the web runs on. Now, there's also a secure version of HTTP called HTTPS, and some websites do force you to use that. Google.com is one. If we go to google.com, we should see HTTPS. Well, we don't here until we actually click on the address, and there that is. Now, the reason why I wanted to use Edge first is because Google hides some of this information from you. And I can understand why, because by this day and age, we don't need to know HTTP and all of that stuff as far as a URL is concerned, because that is the default. If it's on the web, it uses HTTP. But you can notice that all we see here is tutsplus.com. And if we go to google.com, we will see HTTPS. But the reason why we see this is because it's not standard HTTP. It is the secure version of HTTP. So if everything on the web is a resource, that means that there has to be something on the other end of the line that is what we call serving a resource. And that is what a web server does. It sits on the internet and it's listening for what we call HTTP requests. Anytime that we try to go to a website, we are sending an HTTP request to the server of that website. So at tutsplus.com, there is a server listening for requests, and it will send a response back saying either it can or it can't serve that request. The reason why it might not be able to is because whatever we requested doesn't exist, or it could be that the program or the application that's running on the server encountered an error. Now, we can actually see the requests that are being made. If you press F12, this is going to pull up the developer tools in Chrome. You will want to go to the Network tab, and then you will want to refresh the page. And we are going to see a lot of requests. In fact, we see 47 requests. Now, the reason why we see so many is because inside of this web page at tutsplus.com, it is using resources. So the browser downloads the web page for tutsplus.com. It then sees that it needs to download all of these other resources. So it does so. And it tells us whether or not it was successful in doing that. It also tells us what type of request was made, because there are different types. Now, we're not going to go into the different types, but you can see here that all of these are GET requests. That means that we are wanting to get a resource. So then there's this status that says 200. Now, 200 means that everything is okay. So the browser sent a request to tutsplus.com. Tutsplus.com responded saying that I found whatever it is that you are requesting. Here it is. And so we have 200. Now you can see that there are also status numbers of 304. This means that it was not modified since the last time that we made a request for that resource. And if something goes wrong, like if we made a request for something that doesn't exist, then the status would be 404. Or if the program that's running on the web server encountered an error, then we would see a status of 500. Now, there's a lot of other information that goes on with each individual request. If you click on tutsplus.com here, we see what are called headers. This is part of HTTP. Whenever a request is made, this header information is sent with that request. So we see what the request URL is. We are requesting http://tutsplus.com. We are making a GET request, meaning that we are wanting to get that resource. And the response from the server is 200. Everything is okay. And if we scroll down, we can see what the server actually sent for its headers. And there's a lot of header information there. So you would be correct to say that the web, and HTTP specifically, is a client-server paradigm. Our client is our browser. It sends a request to the server, and the server sends a response. Either it contains what we requested, or it contains information as to why the server couldn't give us what we requested. Now, this is why I chose brackets for this course. It has a built-in web server. So whenever we run our page, we will be making a request to a server that is on our computer. And that is very helpful when you want to run and debug your pages. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is the language that we use to, well, mark up our documents. And that is the terminology that we use. We are working with HTML documents. Yes, they are web pages, but technically, they are documents. So you can think of it like a document that you would edit within a word processor. All of the markup is still there, it's just usually hidden from you. And it's a different type of markup, it's not HTML. But whenever you set certain text as a heading, or you bold something, or italicize it, or change the font size, you are marking up that document. And the same is true for HTML. So while this document that I have open here has some structure to it, whenever we view this in the browser in a few moments, we're going to see that all of the structure is gone because it is not marked up. But before we do that, let's briefly go over brackets, because this is the first lesson where we are actually working with this code editor. So with brackets, the idea is that you are working with a project, and a project is basically all of the folders and files inside of another folder. So if we go to my documents, and I have a folder called webdev, and this is where I'm going to put all of the source files for this course, and then I have another folder called HTML primer. That is the project for this lesson. So if we go inside of this folder, we see that I just have this index.html. And if I had other files, they would of course be listed here. So whenever I opened up brackets, I went to File, Open Folder, and then I navigated to the HTML primer folder, because this is the project that I want to work with inside of brackets. So whenever I selected that folder, we see up here HTML primer, that's the name of this project, and then all of the files inside of this folder. And that is just this one file called index.html. Now, if I go back and open up the webdev folder, then we're going to see that things change. Webdev is now the project. And then inside of that is a folder called HTML primer. And we know that it's a folder because you can expand it and see the other files that are inside of there. But I'm going to change this back to open folder and then HTML primer. And then once you open up your folder, you can go to File, New, and then you would create a new document, just save it, and then name it. In this case, I called it index.html, and you should do the same. So create that file, and then you will have something that you can start with for this lesson. Now, this file is going to be available in the code download, so feel free to download it and use that if you want to. I don't expect you to write all of this. Most of this is just lorem ipsum text. Now, the HTML extension is very important. That tells the operating system what to do with the file. It also tells the web server what to do with the file. If it sees that it needs to serve an HTML file, then it knows how to do that. The extension also tells the code editor how to display the text here. Now, right now, all we see is just plain text, and that's because we don't have any HTML in this file. But whenever we start adding HTML, you will see the difference between HTML and just normal text, because brackets will know how to color code the HTML. So before we get into that, let's go ahead and go over to this lightning bolt in the top right corner. If you click on that, that's going to fire up the live preview so that we can see this document in the browser. Now notice that all of the text is jumbled together. And if we view the source code of this web page, we're going to see that we still have the formatting here. But here's the thing. Without any HTML, the browser is just going to take all of the text and it's going to replace all of the white space with just a single space. So all of these line breaks, it removed and replaced it with just a single space. That's why we have this jumbled mess of text. So what we are going to do is add markup so that the browser will know how to display our document. So let's go back to our code editor, and we're going to start with the headings because there are some things inside of this text that stick out as headings. First is this introduction to web development that could also serve as the title for this document. Then there is what you need, and then tips to achieve greatness. So as we are marking up this document, we can think of this introduction to web development as a large size heading. And then for what you need, and then for tips to achieve greatness, then we would have smaller size headings. So that introduction to web development is the most important heading. So we'll start by adding what are called opening and closing tags. That is what we have in HTML. A tag begins with a less than sign, and then there is specific names for the tags. Now for headings, we have H1, and then H2, and we can see from this code completion window here that we have several options. We have H1, that is the highest or the largest heading. List heading that we have is H6. So since this is the most important heading, we're going to go with H1. So we have our less than sign, then the tag name H1, and then a greater than sign. And brackets already created what we call a closing tag. So in between the opening and closing tags, we have our text. So basically we have marked this up as the largest heading that we can have, and we did so with an opening H1 tag and a closing H1 tag. Now this is closing simply because it has that slash. Otherwise, it would be an opening. Now most tags have opening and closing tags. There are some that have just an opening tag. There are others that can be self-closing, and we'll get into that later on. But for now, we're just going to go over the process of marking up this document with some very simple tags. So we have our big heading. Now we want a smaller heading for what you need, because this is a heading, but it's less important than our first heading. So we can go with something like H2, but I'm going to go with H3, and then I'm going to put what you need inside of these opening and closing tags. So we have marked up this heading, and we will essentially do the same thing for this other heading. So we will have H3 there, and we will put our heading text in between the opening and closing tags. Now, I don't want to confuse you, but we call these tags, but the opening and closing tags together are called an element. So if we have H3 and then closing H3, this is the H3 element. And an element is made up of an opening and closing tag. So we have our headings, and if we go back to the browser, let's refresh, we see our headings now. So we're getting somewhere, but notice how the paragraphs are a little different. This first paragraph looks fine. But once again, if we view the source, we have two paragraphs for the heading of what you need. And whenever it's rendered in the browser, we just have one. So we need to mark up our paragraphs so that the browser knows where a paragraph begins and ends. We do that with an element called P. So we have an opening tag of P and a closing tag of P. And we put the paragraph inside of the opening and closing P tags. So we will basically do this for all of our paragraphs. And this is telling the browser that we have headings, and then we also have paragraphs. So whenever we go back to the browser, we are going to see the distinction between especially these two paragraphs and these 2 paragraphs. So let's go back to the browser. We will refresh, and now we have our marked up document. Now, I fully understand if this looks completely weird to you, because we have all been in your shoes. But this is how we create web pages. We have our document and we mark it up with what are called elements. An element is made up of an opening tag and a closing tag. And there are some exceptions to that rule, but for right now, just think of it that way. These elements have special names. H1 tells the browser to display a heading. H3 tells the browser to display a heading, but it is a smaller sized heading than H1. The P element tells the browser to display the text inside of the opening and closing tags as a paragraph. And there are, of course, many, many more elements, and we will be going over quite a few of them within the next few lessons. In the previous lesson, we marked up a very simple document using heading and paragraph elements, and when we viewed it in the browser, we saw how drastic of a difference it is between a document that is not marked up with a document that is marked up. Now, the interesting thing is that our HTML document is what we call invalid. It's missing some very important things. And this is interesting because even though it is an invalid document, we see that the browser still renders it. Now, there's a whole history as to why this takes place. But all you need to know is that the browser is going to take your HTML, be it a valid or an invalid document, and it is going to try to render that document. Now, we should always strive to create valid documents, because valid documents means that our document is going to work, or at least it should work the same in any browser. And that is what we want to achieve. So in this lesson, we are going to take our invalid document and we are going to make it valid. The first thing we need is a document type declaration. This essentially tells any machine or program that's going to load or read our HTML document that it is an HTML document. So on the first line, we're going to add an open angle bracket or a less than sign, whatever you want to call it, followed by an exclamation point, and then the term doc type, DOCTYPE, and then a space, and then HTML, and then a closing angle bracket. So we have what looks like an opening tag for an element, but it is not. This is a processing instruction that says that the doc type, or rather the document type, is HTML. So we have our doc type. The next thing we need is the HTML element. This is what we call the root element. This is what is going to contain everything else within the document. And an HTML document has a root element called HTML. So eventually we're going to take all of our content here and we are going to put it inside of the HTML element. But there's a couple of other things that we need to do. First, we need to add an element called head. This is inside of the HTML document because an HTML document is divided into 2 parts. We have the head and then we have the body. Now, the head is not the header, at least as you would think visually. You know, if we go to a website, let's try Amazon.com. You know, usually the header of a website is here at the top. So what we see in this dark gray area would be considered the header. This is not what I am talking about with this head element. What is contained inside of the head element is header information about the document. So we would have a title for our document. And in this case, we could use what we have for this H1 element, Introduction to Web Development. So this could be the title of the document. And so anything that opens up this HTML document for rendering or for other purposes, it would know that the title is what we have specified here. We can also add other metadata. In fact, there is an element called meta, and you can add a variety of other pieces of information. We can also add our styles here. We can also add JavaScript here as well, but we're going to refrain from doing that. We are just going to have a title inside of the head element. So we have head and then the body. Now the body is where the content of the document is going to be contained. So that is everything else that we have. So we want to take all of this, let's cut it, and let's paste it inside of the body element. So we have essentially said that all of this is the body of our document. And so we end up with a document that is highly structured. An HTML document is a document made up of multiple elements, and those elements can be contained inside of other elements. So I'm just going to structure all of this, at least visually, so that if we were to open up this document in some other editor, then based upon the white space, we could tell what is contained inside of other elements. So for example, the head element is very noticeably inside of the HTML element. Now we can get rid of the tabs and it's not going to affect how it is viewed within the browser. But from a code standpoint, we want all of this white space. It just makes things a little easier to read. So as we scroll down, we can see that all of these P elements and the H3 elements, they are all contained inside of body. Now, if they were not inside of body, then we would have an invalid document because the body is where all of this stuff is contained. While you can put this H1 inside of the head element, that is invalid. Now, if we go to the browser and refresh, we're not going to notice really anything different here. Now, we see this document does look different. In fact, we see that we have essentially two of the same document that we had before. The reason is because it is updating as we update our document in brackets. So if we refresh, then we see what we saw before, but it looks almost the same. There's a slight little difference as far as the styling is concerned, but that's not very noticeable because it's padding and margins and things like that. And we will talk about all of that whenever we start talking about styling. So now that we have a valid document, we can start adding more elements to it, because for right now we've just used H1, H3, and P elements, but there are a lot of other elements that we can use in an HTML document. And we will look at some of those in the next lesson. HTML has a lot of elements, and you can place those elements in a variety of different categories. But in this lesson, I'm going to focus on just two categories. We have what are called semantic elements, and then we have more generic elements. But first, what do I mean by semantic elements? Well, these are elements that by their very name or their definition, they have some specific purpose, so that whenever we see them in an HTML document, we know what that is used for. Like for example, in our document, we have H1, H3, and P elements. These are all semantic elements because they are used for very specific purposes. So whenever we see an H1 element, we know that whatever is inside of the opening and closing H1 tags, we know that that is a heading. The same is true for an H3 element. And because we have different levels of headings, we also know the importance of those headings. So just by looking at our HTML, we can point out and say, there's a heading, and down here is another heading. Well, the same can be applied to P elements. That means paragraph. But what is a paragraph? Well, it contains content. So we can say the same thing, that anything inside of an opening and closing P tag is content. And that is more the body, or rather the main content that we are concerned with within the document. So in this particular document, we can look at all of the P elements and we can know that this is main content, this is main content, and this is main content. Now, that isn't always going to be the case because there are some elements that are more generic, and we can use them for just about anything that we want. Now, we want to use them only in times when there's not already an element for that specific purpose. Like, for example, one of the generic elements is called div, just D-I-V. It stands for division. And basically, you are dividing a document into different sections. So if we wanted to have a sidebar, we could do that, and we could specify a sidebar with a div element. And then if we wanted to have the main content inside of another div element, we could do that. So in fact, let's do that. I'm going to move these div elements to the top of the body. I'm going to take all of the main content that we have and put it inside of this other div element. Now, the problem with just using div elements is that they are not semantic. We don't know what these div elements are for. Now, we know right now that this div element contains all of the content for this document, so we could guess that this is for the main content. But with something like a div element, we want something specific. We want to say that, okay, this div element is for the main content, this div element is for the sidebar, so that when anybody else is looking at our document, they know what it is. And it's not just for other people. As you will soon find out, whenever you write a web page and you just leave it alone, you come back 6 months later, you will have no idea what you did inside of that document. So we can give some semantics to our div elements by using attributes. And there's a couple of attributes that we can use, but in this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to an attribute called ID. Now, first of all, what is an attribute? Well, it just adds information to an element. And an attribute goes inside of the opening tag, and you can have a variety of different other attributes. So there's this ID attribute here. We have an equal sign and then a pair of quotes. Now, you don't have to have the quotes, but I like to have the quotes. And then if we wanted to have another attribute, let's find one here in this list. And this isn't a complete list. This is just what Brackets thinks that we can use here. One of them is class, and we will talk about class whenever we start adding style. So we have an ID attribute and we have a class attribute, but right now they don't have any values assigned to them. But you can have multiple attributes here, and that's what I wanted to show you for right now. But let's get rid of class. We're going to stick with ID. Now, this is a unique identifier. This is a way that we could eventually find this div element based upon the value that we have with the ID. So this needs to be unique, and we can say that, okay, this is sidebar. And then we will give another ID attribute to this other div element that says main-content. Now you can have dashes, you can have underscores, or you can have nothing and just one string. I like to break mine up so that we can see that this is main content and that this is sidebar. Although we could argue that it is side-bar, I'm just going to stick with sidebar. Okay, so we have essentially two sections within our document. And if we look at this in the browser, right now we're still just going to see kind of what we saw before. It looks like that nothing else changed. However, let's add some content to our sidebar. Let's just have this is the sidebar. And we're going to see that this will change. Oh, there it is right there. This is the sidebar that appears above where we have the main content. Now, a sidebar should be on the side, and the main content should be next to the sidebar. And throughout this lesson, and probably the next one, we're not going to see that, because that is achieved with CSS. But as far as our markup is concerned, this is perfectly fine, and this is more of what we would want to do. But in a sidebar, we would have more content that isn't really pertaining to this particular document, but it would be something that would be used site-wide, like a navigation pane. And a navigation pane is just a list of links. So we have a semantic element for displaying a list. In fact, we have two of them. We have what are called unordered lists, and then we have an ordered list. The only difference between the two is that an unordered list has bullet points. So that could be a little circle or some other type of glyph, but an ordered list has numbers instead of bullets. Since this is going to be a list of links, we're going to use the unordered list, and that is simply UL. And this is a semantic element. Whenever you see UL, you know that it is a list of things. Because what is contained inside of a list, be it an unordered list or an ordered list, is a bunch of list items. This too is a semantic element. It's simply LI, and then we would have our link. Now we're not going to have actual links yet because we don't have any other documents. But we could have something like home, and then let's have another item here. That would be article. which would be this document that we are looking at. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we now have our list of soon-to-be links and then our main content. And while the browser is rendering this all as just one big large chunk of text, our markup is where it is all separated. And that is very important because whenever we come in and add style, we will be adding that style based upon the markup that we have. So we want to divide our web pages into the different distinct sections so that we can style them. Now, there's one other generic element that I want to point out. We have div, the other is called span. And the two are somewhat similar in that they are used to contain content or a bunch of different content. But the big difference between a div element and a span element is that a div element is what we call a block level element, whereas a span is what we call inline. And that is something too that we are going to be working with more whenever we get into CSS, but I can demonstrate what these types of elements are. If you right-click on anything within the browser, I'm going to do so on this H1 element. Let's go to Inspect Element, and then this is going to pull up the developer tools for Chrome. Now, we want to go over to Elements, and this shows all of the HTML as it is rendered here in the page. This is not like viewing source. Viewing source is viewing the actual HTML. Although we can see that brackets is injecting some attributes into these elements. But what we have here in the developer tools is as it is actually rendered within the page. So you can see here we have two div elements. And if you hover your mouse over these two elements, it highlights it within the page. So first we have that first div element for the sidebar, and you can see up at the top that it is just a block. And then the next div element is another block, but it is underneath the first div element. So whatever is inside of a div element by default is basically on a new line. So in that sense, it's a lot like a paragraph, but it's more for structural purposes as opposed to just content. And then if we drill down in this second div element and into the first P element, that's where we put that span, here we see that span. And in this case, it's on ipsum, but the text is still on the same line. So this is what I mean that it is an inline element. It doesn't put the content on a different line. It just keeps it in line as it already is. And this is useful when you want to supply style to individual things within the text. That is something else that we will be looking at in a later lesson. So in this lesson, I introduced some very important concepts. The first is that we have semantic HTML, and then we have more generic HTML. We also talked about attributes, and more specifically, the ID attribute. An ID attribute is a way that you can provide a unique identifier for a given element. And you can use an ID attribute on just about any element. We talked about div elements and span elements, how they are used to add structure to our document. And we briefly discussed the difference between a block level element and an inline element. Well, we could spend a lot of time talking about HTML, the different elements that they have, the different attributes, but we need to get moving on into style. So in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how you can add style to your document so that you can style your elements. By itself, HTML is very limited when it comes to changing or adding style to our documents. And really, we wouldn't want to use HTML anyway, because we've been there. In older versions of HTML, we had elements that we could use to change the font, such as the font style, the size, the color. We could also do some other things, and it was a nightmare. So we have learned from our mistakes. We don't use HTML to do anything as far as styling is concerned. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of that because it's really irrelevant. We use a language called CSS, and that's really all that you need to know. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it allows us to completely separate our markup, which is what we have here, from our style. And that's really what we want. Now we can add style using CSS in 3 different ways. Really, one of those is the best way, but I'm going to show you all 3. The first is what we really don't want to do unless if we are prototyping something, because it's really easy to get started with. And that is by simply adding a style attribute to our element. And we can use this attribute on just about any element. So I'm adding this style attribute to the body. So this means that whatever I specify inside of this style attribute is going to be applied to everything within the body. And I am going to change the color. Right now it defaults to black. I'm going to change it to blue. So I have color followed by a colon and then the value for color. Now in CSS terminology, we have color, which is the property, and then we have the value for that property. And instead of using an equal sign, we use a colon. So let's save this. Let's go to the browser, and we are going to refresh, and we see that the color of the text changes to blue. Now, we are not limited to having just one property inside of the style attribute. We can use a semicolon after that, and then we just define another property. There's one called text-decoration, and we're going to say underline. And I'm going to go ahead and end that with a semicolon so that if we ever decided to add something else to the style attribute, then we could just do that. So the color is blue, and everything should be underlined now. So whenever we refresh, yes, we see that that is the case. Now, the problem with this approach is that it's not very different from what we used to use with the HTML elements. In this case, the style is what we call tightly coupled to the markup. So instead of using a style attribute on our element, inside of the head, we can add a style element. And then we can do essentially the same thing that we did before. We want the color to blue. We want the text decoration to underline. But then we have to say, okay, what do we want to apply those properties to? And we have what's called a CSS selector. It's going to select an element within our document, and it's going to apply those properties. Well, in this case, we want to apply those properties to the body element. So we just say body. That is the name of our element, and I'm going to paste in those properties. So we have the color is going to be blue, the text decoration is going to be underlined, and those properties are contained within a pair of curly braces. So we have the selector, which is the body element, followed by an opening curly brace. We have our CSS properties and their values, and then we have a closing curly brace. So we can get rid of this style attribute here. We can go back to the browser, and we're going to see the same results that we saw before. Now, this approach is slightly better because now we have style that can be applied to the entire document as opposed to an individual element. But we can take this a step further, and we can define our styles inside of an external file so that then we could link to that file and use it in not just this document, but in any of the other documents that we might create. So let's go to File, New, and let's call this first.css. So I'm going to save first.css, and we are going to copy this selector and paste it into this CSS file. And let's format the white space so that it's a little bit easier to read. And then we're going to get rid of this style element. And instead, we're going to use an element called link. Now, there are 3 things that we need to specify here. The first is an attribute called rel. And this is going to be a style sheet. And we can see that brackets was prompting us for that value. So we have link, we have the rel attribute set to style sheet. The next is type. And once again, we see that brackets is prompting us with a value. The type is text/CSS. And then finally, we have the href attribute. This is where that file is actually located. And that is here inside of the same folder as our index.html. And then we want to close that tag. Now, there's not a closing tag like this for a link. Instead, we can use something that's called a self-closing tag, which looks like that. So now we can go back to the browser, we can refresh, And voila, we have the same results. And as I mentioned before, the beauty of this approach is that we can use this CSS file in any web page now. So let's create another one. Let's save this as second.html. We're going to copy everything that we have inside of index and paste that into second.html. But let's change something. Instead of the title being Introduction to Web Development, let's just say second page. And we can do the same thing for this H1 element, just so that we know that we are looking at the second page. And let's go to the browser. Let's duplicate our existing tab, and let's open up second.html. We see that the same styles are applied. So if we decided that, okay, we no longer want to have blue underlined text, instead we want red underlined text. Or now let's just change the color. Let's get rid of the underline because, usually we wouldn't want our text underlined. And if we look at both of these pages, we're going to see that the color in both of them is going to be red. So the second page, the color is red. Let's go back to index.html. The color is red as well. So this makes it very easy to maintain the style that we have throughout multiple pages. Now, contrast that with some of the other approaches. Like, for example, if we used the style here, then we would have to change the color value. So let's say that color is blue, and then we would have to change that to red. Then we would have to go to the second HTML, and we would need to do the same thing here. It would have the style attribute, which would be set to blue, and then we would have to change that to red. So instead of going to each individual web page, we just have to open up that CSS file, make the changes that we want to make, and then we would see those changes along all of the pages that reference that CSS file. And so now that you know how to add style to your web pages, in the next lesson, we're going to look a little bit more at CSS. We've seen how we can apply styles to a certain element by specifying that element name within our CSS. But we can also select other elements using different selectors. And we will look at that in the next lesson. In the previous lesson, I very briefly introduced you to CSS, the technology that we use for applying style to our documents. In this lesson, we're going to look at a couple of different things. We will look at the more common CSS properties that we would use within our web pages. We will also look at more selectors so that we can select more elements and apply styles to them. Well, first, let's talk about the terminology, because we have some new terminology that we use with CSS. The first is a CSS rule, which is made up of two parts. We have what's called the selector, and then we have the declaration. Now, the selector selects the elements that we want to apply style to. So this selector is for the body element. So the style that we have declared here will be applied to the body element. And the only thing that we are doing right now is changing the text color to red. So if we look at this in the browser, we of course have red text. But this isn't something that we would normally do. With a white background, we usually just keep the text black, or it might be a darker shade of gray. So we're just going to remove this property, and that is going to revert back to the default value of black. Now, we don't control the default values. That's done within the browser, and the user can change those values in most browsers, but most don't, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay, so we have our body. Well, let's change the font of our body because, yeah, this is fine, but this is the default font. We want something a little bit more modern, I guess you could say. So we can type font, and brackets is going to give us a variety of suggestions that we might want to use to modify the font for the body. Now, what I want to do is change the font size. So you can see that the property is font-size, followed by a colon, and then our value. So let's do something that's fairly large, and let's do 18. Now, it's not enough to just use a numeric value here. There are different units that CSS supports, and we need to supply the unit because by itself, It's unclear if this is using points or pixels or if it's a relative value. So let's stick with something that's an absolute size, and we'll just go with pixels. This means that the font is going to be 18 pixels high. And if we go back to the browser and refresh the page, we're going to see that the text does indeed change. It is much larger than it was before. But let's also change the font face itself, and that's actually called the font family. So font-family, and we can do a variety of different things here. We can use a named font, Arial in this case, which every Windows machine has this font. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we see that the font does indeed change. Now there are some computing systems that might not have the Arial font, in which case we would need to supply a fallback font. And we do that with a comma and then whatever name that we wanted to use. So we could say Helvetica. And so if a browser or a computer doesn't support Arial, then it would fall back to whatever we specify here, Helvetica. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we're not going to see any difference here because Arial is being used. Now we can add as many fallbacks as we want. We can say that, okay, we want to use Arial, but if that's not available, we can use Helvetica. But if that's not available, then we might want to use something a bit more generic. And CSS has a variety of generic font names. In our case, Arial is without any serifs, so it's sans serif. And I think Helvetica is as well. I'm really not sure about that. So we can come in here and we can say that, okay, if the computer doesn't have Arial or Helvetica, then we just want to use a font that is sans serif. And that would be fine. Now, we have two properties here. But there's also a font property that combines several of the other font properties. So with just font, we can say that we want a font that is 18 pixels high, and it is Arial or Helvetica or sans serif. And that will give us the same results. Now I'm going to comment out these two just for the sake of having them in the code download so that you know that they are available. Because if you want to change one of these properties, then it's more useful to use that property itself instead of font. Now to comment out CSS, you use a slash followed by an asterisk, and then everything that follows that is going to be a comment until it reaches an asterisk followed by another slash. So these two lines are commented. The browser isn't going to use them. It's going to use this single font property. So just to show you that we get the same results, there you go. Now we might want to adjust the line height. That is the space between the lines. And we can do that with the line height property. That is line-height. And then once again, we want a numeric value. Now you can see that brackets is suggesting two values, inherit and normal. Now inherit is a CSS keyword. That means that it is a special word that is used in CSS. And it basically means that we want to use whatever value has been applied for the line height in any parent element. Now, the body element doesn't have a parent element, although it really does. It's HTML. HTML is a parent element, and it has a child called body. However, we don't really apply any line height to the HTML element. So in our case, inherit really isn't going to give us anything. Instead, we would want to specify some numeric value. And I really have no idea what this is going to do. So I'm going to do 24 pixels, and we will just see what this looks like in the browser. And I'm not really clear if that added space or removed it. So let's do something like 32, and that should definitely add more space there. And really that might be too much, but we're going to leave that alone. Now we might want to change the background color of an element. In this case, it's the body. And we can say background color. And we have a variety of named colors that we can use. We can also use hexadecimal numbers. A hexadecimal number starts with a £, and it's broken up into 3 groups. We have red, green, and blue. A background color of 000000 is black. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we're not going to see anything because our text is black and the background color is black. Now for this lesson, we're going to leave the background color as white, or whatever the default is for the browser. So I'm going to comment that line out so that you can have that in the code download. And for now, we're going to skip on to the selectors because there are a lot of properties that we can use. There are too many to list within this course. And I will be using more properties in the following lessons, and I will tell you what they are and what they are used for. But for now, let's just skip on to our selectors. So we want to add some more style. We have changed the text of our body, but now we want to do some special things for like the headings. And somewhere in here, I believe we still have a span element. So let's start with the headings. Let's do something special there. They, of course, are different from normal text because they are typically larger and they are usually bold. But let's also do something like italicize them. So our selector is going to select both the H1 elements and the H3 elements. And we can use multiple selectors within a single rule. All we have to do is just separate them with a comma. So we have H1, and then we also want to select the H3 elements. So we have H1, comma, H3, and then our declaration. Now, usually you would see this done on 2 lines so that it's very clear that this rule is for H1 and H3 elements. And we are going to italicize this, and we do that with a property called font style. And the value is, you can see here, brackets is prompting us with italic, normal, or oblique. We're going to go with italic, and that will give our heading elements an italic font. Now, it's going to keep the size as well as the weight of the font because we didn't change any of those. The only thing that we did is added the ability to make it italicized. So if you wanted to change the weight or the size, you would have to explicitly specify those properties. So for the size, we would have to go and use the font size property and then give it whatever size that we wanted to. However, in that case, we wouldn't want to use both the H1 and the H3 elements in the selector because we wouldn't want those to be the same size. But we're not going to worry about that, so let's just get rid of this font size property. Now, if we look at our markup, we have 2 div elements that have IDs. One is an ID of sidebar, the other is an ID of main content. And we want to style these elements differently. And we can reference both of these by their ID. So we go back to our CSS file. Let's start with the sidebar. In order to select an element by its ID, you start with a # and then the name of the ID, sidebar. So pound in CSS means ID. So this is the ID of sidebar. And let's give this a background color of green. Eventually, we are going to change this so that it is actually a sidebar. But for now, we're going to give it a different background color than what we would have for the main content. And we would do the same thing for main content. We start with the # and then main-content. And this is going to have a background color. Let's do something like gray, or we can choose one of these values. Let's do light gray. And then we will see in the browser that our sidebar is green, and then our main content is gray. So we can select elements by their name. We can also select elements by their ID. Well, let's go to our markup, because we've used a span element in one place, but let's use it in a couple of different ones. And it doesn't matter where, just pick some random spots and surround it with an opening and closing span tag. And I'm going to add a total of 3. And we are going to style these. However, we want to style some of these spans differently. Let's say that we want this ipsum to be red because this would be considered an error. Of course, it's not, but just for the sake of this demonstration, the ipsum is going to be an error. But we want to use these other 2 span elements for something else. So we can go to our style sheet, we can type span, And if we do color is red, then we're going to see that all of the span elements in our document now have a color of red, but we don't want that. We want only the span elements that are considered an error to have a color of red. So we need some way to make our error span to be different from the others. And for that, we can use something called a class. A class is a classification. It's something that we would apply to multiple elements. So we're going to give this first span element a class attribute, and its value is going to be error. And we will go back to our CSS. And instead of this span rule, we're going to specify that if it has a class of error, it's going to have a color of red. To specify a class, you start with a period and then the class name, error. So the pound sign is for ID, the period or the dot is for classes. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, now we see that ipsum is red, but the other span elements are not. But let's give those other elements a style. So we're going to add span once again, and let's give this a color of purple, something that's not red, but it will be visible against the green and the gray. So let's refresh, and now we have our red for the error, then we have the purple for our other spans. But then later on, if we wanted one of these to also be error text, we can go to that element and we can add that class. So let's add this third element with a class equal to error, and it's going to apply that style to that element. So now we have an error here, and we have an error here, and then we have this purple text here. Now we can apply this class to any element. So if we wanted to say that, okay, this heading is going to have the error color as well. So we can say class equals error, and then what you need is going to be in red. And that's the beauty of a class. You can apply it to any element that you want to. However, if you wanted to only apply the color of red to span elements that have a class of error, you can go back to the selector and you can say that span dot error will have a color of red. So this means that all span elements that have a class of error is going to have a color of red, and only those elements. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, our heading is going to go back to black, although it helps if you save the document first. So let's refresh, and you can see that that has gone back. However, if we wanted to have a different color for that heading element, we could say H3 and then error. And for our headings, if they are in error, then we would do something not necessarily red, but red-ish. So crimson, that looks like a good color. So let's use crimson for our headings. And we will go back, and we can see a noticeable difference between the crimson color and the red color. Now, just like properties, there are a variety of different CSS selectors, and we could spend a lot of time talking about them and how they work. However, for the sake of this course, we're going to move on to the next lesson, and we will modify the layout of our page using CSS. Throughout this course, we've been working with a single document. We started with just plain text, then we added some markup, and we even divided our document into two distinct sections. We have the main content, and then we have what is supposed to be the sidebar. But of course, whenever we view this in the browser, we have nothing like that. Now, we see what is supposed to be in the sidebar, as well as the main content, but the sidebar is on top of the main content. And if you'll remember, the reason why this is because we use div elements, and div elements are block level elements. That means that it essentially creates a block within the page, and that's very apparent now that we have added some background color to both of these sections. But now we want an actual sidebar, and so that is what we are going to do in this lesson. But I'm going to do something a little differently. I'm going to have both the editor and the browser up at the same time. The editor will be on the left and the browser will be on the right. The reason being because brackets has a wonderful feature that allows us to edit our code and it will automatically update within the browser. Now, it's not the only editor that has this particular feature. There are many that do. But since we are using brackets, it's worth demonstrating this feature because it is very helpful. As you are typing, you can see the ramifications of whatever modifications that you're making. Now, notice that whenever I click on any one of these CSS rules, on the right-hand side, we see the browser select those elements. Like, for example, right now, I selected the main content, and we can see that there is a little blue border around the main content. Whenever I click on the sidebar rule, we see that the sidebar has a blue border, and it's kind of hard to see here because the background color is green. However, if we go down to the span selector, let's click on that, we see all of the span elements within the document are surrounded by a little blue border. That's because this CSS rule is for span elements, and so it is marking all of those elements that are selected with this selector. If we go to the H3 selector with a class of error, we see that only that H3 element is selected. We will see the same thing for the span elements that have a class of error. We have just two of those, one in the first paragraph and then one in the third. So it's a pretty nice feature. If you wanted to see what elements are being selected by a particular CSS rule, then just put your mouse over that and you will see that. And it's supposed to do the same thing for HTML. Wherever we put our cursor, it's also supposed to select the elements in the browser, but for some reason, that is not working right now. But that's not very important. What is important is that we do what we actually want to do, and that is put our sidebar on the side of the page. So we're going to go to the CSS rule for our sidebar. That is with the # for the ID, and then sidebar. We want to come in here and add a property called float. This essentially says that we want to take this element and we want to float it on either the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the element that contains our sidebar. Now, if we look at the HTML, that is the body. So it's going to take our sidebar and it's going to put it on the left or the right of our body. And we get to tell it, right or left. There's actually 4 possible values. There's inherit, there's left, there's none, and then there's right. But we want to go with left, so I'm going to choose left. And over on the right-hand side, you can see that the page automatically updated. So we can type whatever that we want to type, and we can see what it would look like in the browser. So that's what it would look like if we floated it on the right, but we're going to do left. Now notice that the dimensions changed. It's no longer as long as the entire page as it was as a normal div element. So we want to change the width, and we do that with a property called simply width. Now we can come in here and we can give it an actual pixel value. So if we wanted to say that the sidebar is 150 pixels wide, then we can do that. We can also use percentages. So we can say that the sidebar is supposed to be 25% of its container, which is the body. So it's going to calculate the width of the body, and it's going to set the width of the sidebar to be 25% of that. So as we would adjust the size of the browser, we would see that the width would change for the sidebar. So let's leave this as a percentage because that's more flexible than setting an absolute pixel value. But now notice that the text within our main document just flows around our sidebar, and that might be what we want it to do. But in most cases, we want 2 columns. We want on the left to be a complete column for our sidebar, and then on the right to be a column that contains our content. So we will go to our main content, and we can do a couple of different things. The first thing we could do is float that on the right-hand side. Now notice that it put our content on a new line. The reason being because even though we floated it on the right-hand side, the width of the element is too much to fit next to the sidebar. So it put it onto a new line. So we could come in here and say that we want our width to be 75%. And then that would change the width of our main content enough so that it would then fit on the right side of the screen. Now that's one way that we could achieve this. We could also not use a float. So I'm going to comment this out, and instead we will use something called padding. Now padding is exactly what it sounds like. We are padding an element so that its contents are inside of that padding. And we can pad all sides of an element. We can pad the top, the right, the left, and the bottom. In this case, we really just want to pad the left-hand side of the element. So we can say that the padding on the left, which is padding dash left, is going to be 25%. And that puts all of the content inside of our main contents div element over here on the right-hand side. Now the element, as you can see, is still the full size of the body, but the content, since we've added that padding to the left-hand side, is padded on the left. And now let's get rid of the background colors because that kind of ruins the effect. So the sidebar no longer has a background color. We will do the same thing for main content. And now we will have our sidebar on the actual sidebar. Well, we do have one other document. It's that second HTML. And let's go ahead and add a link to that inside of our sidebar. So our home will be our index, and then the article will be that second HTML. And for this, let's go to the full size editor. And we are still going to use our unordered list and our list items, but inside of our list items, we're going to use a new element called A. It stands for anchor. And anchors can be used for a variety of reasons, but what we want to use an anchor for is what's called a hyperlink to another page. To do that, we use an href attribute inside of our A element, and that is set to whatever document that we want to navigate to. Now our home is going to be this file, index.html, and then we will have text in between the opening and closing A tags that simply says home. And for the article, we will once again use an A element. The href attribute is going to be set to second HTML. And then for the text of our link is going to be article. So whenever we view this in the browser, we now have links. And if we click on any one of these, then it takes us to that page. Now notice that the second HTML page is also laid out exactly like our main page. And that is because we referenced the same CSS file. So this once again demonstrates why we would want to use an external style sheet, because both of these documents use the same markup. The changes that we made to the CSS made it work in both of those pages. So by itself, HTML really doesn't do anything except allow us to mark up our documents and give them structure. What really allows us to lay out our page is CSS. Well, in the next lesson, we're going to add some JavaScript, which allows us to add behavior to our web pages. We're not going to do anything fancy, but it will add some pizzazz. Unlike HTML and CSS, JavaScript is a full-fledged programming language, and that's really good because we need a powerful language to do the things that we need JavaScript to do. We use JavaScript to manipulate our HTML. By that I mean we can move elements around on the page. We can change the document structure by moving an element to some other place. We can remove elements, create elements on the fly. We can do just about anything that we want. But we can also manipulate the style of our HTML through JavaScript. So it gives us an extreme amount of power within our web pages. And if you are getting into web development as a serious hobby or as a career, you almost always have to know JavaScript. So if that is what your plan is, learn JavaScript because you will use it. If you want to learn how to program, start with JavaScript because it is a very good first language to learn. Now, with saying that, I am not going to teach you JavaScript. I'm not going to teach you how to program. Those are two very complex topics, And we have some courses here at Tuts Plus to teach you those exact things. So I am going to explain what I'm writing so that you will have an understanding of what something does, but I'm not going to teach you the fundamentals of JavaScript. So in this lesson, we are going to add the ability to hide our sidebar. And at the same time, we are going to expand the main content so that it fills up the screen. So we're going to add something over here in the top right-hand corner that we can click on. And whenever we click, it's going to hide the sidebar and make the content full screen. Whenever we click on that thing again, then it's going to set everything back. So the first thing we need is what I'm going to call the control bar. It's what's going to go in to the top right corner. So that's going to be a div element, and I'm going to place this at the top of the body. It really doesn't matter where we put it because we are eventually going to remove it from the document flow. So this is a div element. Let's give it an ID of control-bar, and let's have some text, something like toggle sidebar. And we want to change the size because whenever we move it over, it's going to get in the way of our title. Now, right now, this is just a normal div element, so we see it as a block level element, but we aren't going to have that. We are going to remove it from the document flow, which is going to remove the block aspects of a div. So in our CSS, we're going to add a rule for control-bar. And the first thing we're going to change is the font size. So we can do this in a couple of different ways. We can use an absolute value if we wanted to do that, or we can use a relative value with the EM unit. And this is what we are going to do just to demonstrate the EM. Now, 1 EM is kind of like 100%. So right now, the text of our control bar is at 100% of its size. So if we wanted to decrease that, we could say that 0.75 EM, and we can see that the font size changed, but let's do 0.60 EM. That's small enough that it shouldn't interfere with anything else. It's also, well, it's kind of readable. I guess it really depends on how well your eyes are. So we have our font size. Now we want to position this over on the top right corner, but we also want to move our sidebar and the main content up to where it was originally. Now, we do this very easily by setting the position property to absolute. Now, position has several options, and they all do different things, but the one that we want is absolute. You can see that it removed the control bar from the document flow. Everything just kind of shifted up except for the control bar. And this also allows us to position it anywhere within the document. So we can do that with two properties. We can say top, which is going to set the top of the element to wherever we specify within the page. And if we say 0, then that's going to be at the very top. Now, the coordinate system within the document is pretty simple. The most top of the document is 0, and positive values will move the element down. So if we say that the top is 50 pixels, then it moved it down 50 pixels. If we say negative 50 pixels, then it's going to move it up, and we don't see it at all. But we want 0. Now, whenever you set a numeric value as 0, you don't have to specify any units, because it doesn't matter what the unit is, 0 is 0. So we're going to set top to 0. Now, we're going to use right, and that's going to set the right part of the element to wherever we specify. And if we say 0 here, then that's going to be on the far right of the screen. So if we set the right property to a positive value, then it's going to shift that to the left. There is a left property that is the opposite of right. It starts at the left, and any positive value is going to move it to the right because we are positioning based on the left, in this case, the left side of the element. But we want it on the right side of the screen. So we will use the right property, the value is 0, and we have that styled. Let's also change the cursor. That's something that you can do whenever you move your mouse over something within the website. You can change the cursor. And in this case, we want to use the pointer. That is what you would see with a link. So whenever we move our mouse over here, we see that the cursor changes to the pointer. So this is all that we need to do as far as setting up the CSS for our new element. And now we just need to write our JavaScript that whenever we click on this toggle sidebar, it's going to change the style of our document. So let's go to File, New. Let's save this as toggle sidebar.js. JavaScript files have an extension of JS. Now, I'm not going to be following JavaScript best practices here. I'm going to keep things as simple as possible so that you can understand what is going on, because some of the best practices, well, let's just say it adds some complexity and confusion, and we don't really need that here. So the first thing we want to do is get the elements that we want to work with. That is our sidebar and the main content. So basically, we need to go to the document and we want to request those elements. So we start with document. This represents our HTML document. And this has what's called a method called getElementById. Now, a method is something that we execute. So this is going to do some work. And in our case, it's going to get us the element by whatever ID that we specify. We call this method, or we execute this method with a pair of parentheses, but it needs to know what ID that we want. So we pass that. And the first thing we want is the sidebar. So this is going to give us that div element with an ID of sidebar. Now we do need to store this in what's called a variable so that we can reference it anytime that we want to, because we don't want to call this every time. That's a lot to type. So instead, we store it in a variable. You can think of a variable as a box that you put things in so that you can retrieve them later on. And you create a variable by using the var keyword. Now, a keyword, as I've mentioned in a previous lesson, is a special word, but for JavaScript, it's also reserved. These have very specific meanings, and we can only use them for their specific meanings. And I'm going to turn off word wrap so that it doesn't do any weird formatting here. So we start with var, followed by a space, and then the name of our variable. And we can call this anything that we want. We could call it SB, short for sidebar, but really we want something that's readable, because whenever we come back to this in a few months, we want to be able to quickly go over the code and see what's going on. So sidebar, well, that's pretty clear as to what that is. So we are getting that element and we are storing it in the sidebar variable. Now we want our main content. So I'm going to create another variable called main content. Now, one thing about JavaScript is that it is what's called case sensitive. So this main content is different than a main content with a lowercase c. So whenever you create a variable, and later on we're going to create a function, be very aware of the casing that you use, because you could introduce an error or a bug in your code if you're not keeping track of what you called something. Now, the reason why the C is uppercase here is because I'm using what's called camel casing. We start with one word, main, and then every word after that begins with a capital letter. It's called camel casing because we end up with humps within our names. And camel casing is used in a variety of languages, and it is the convention in JavaScript. So we want to retrieve that div element with an ID of main content. So we will do the same thing by calling document.getElementById, and then we pass in main content, and that will give us that element. So now that we have our sidebar and the main content elements, we can manipulate them with JavaScript. We will start with sidebar, then we say dot, and then style. Now this style maps directly to the style attribute on our sidebar. So if we look at the div element with an ID of sidebar, if we came in here and said style equals and then put something there, then we would be able to access that through this style in our JavaScript. Now, in our HTML, we want to avoid that. But with our JavaScript, this is fine because this is one of the ways that we can manipulate the style. So we're going to change a property called display. And display, as its name implies, controls how an element is displayed. If we set display to none, then that element is going to not be displayed within the document. So we are going to manipulate the display property for our sidebar, and then we are going to change the main contents padding left, because if you'll remember, whenever we set up the main content, we didn't float that element like we did with the sidebar. Instead, we just set the padding left. So we are essentially going to do the same thing, except that here we say padding left. There's not a dash here. That would be illegal in JavaScript. Instead, we say padding left equals, and we are going to set that to 0. That's going to change the padding left so that it will fill the entire document. And then whenever we want to restore everything, we will essentially set these same properties, but we will remove the values that we have assigned them. So whenever we set display to none and padding left to 0, then we are hiding the sidebar and expanding the content. Whenever we set display to nothing here, and the same thing for padding left, then we are restoring those elements to their original state. Now, we want to do these things every time we click on our control bar. And so we do that with what we call an event. An event is something that takes place within a web page. And with JavaScript, we can listen for these events so that we can execute JavaScript code whenever they take place. So we want to listen for the click event on our toggle sidebar. So we want to retrieve our control bar. So we're going to do that, control bar, and we will use document get element by ID, and the ID is control bar. And then we are going to set up the click event handler. We do that with a method called add event listener. Instead of retrieving something like get element by ID, this is going to set up our event handler. We need to tell it what event we want to listen for. In this case, we want to listen for the click events on our control bar. And whenever someone clicks on this element, we want to execute some code. And for that, we need a function. A function is like a method. It's something that we can execute in order to do something. In our case, we are going to use a function to toggle the sidebar. So I am calling this function toggle sidebar. You define a function beginning with the function keyword, followed by the name of the function, and then a pair of parentheses. There's a few other things that we could add here, but we're just going to keep things as simple as possible. And then inside of this function, we want to make a decision. We need to toggle the state of our sidebar. So we need to check to see if we have a value for our display of the sidebar. Because if we do, if it's set to none, then we want to restore everything back. So really this is going to look like this. We have an if statement, and then we have what's called a condition. A condition is something that is going to return true or false so that we can make a decision based upon that condition. So we want to say sidebar.style.display. Now, if we have assigned a value of none to display, then this is going to be true, which means that the sidebar is already hidden. So we want to restore everything, and we are going to do just that. We will put our code that restores the sidebar in the main content there. And then if this condition is false, then we have an else. So we have if this is true, then this executes. Otherwise, whatever we define inside of this else block is going to execute. And all of these things are surrounded by curly braces. That is a code block. So we have this toggle sidebar function. We need to specify that here. So we say control bar dot add event listener, open parentheses, we pass in click, and then toggle sidebar. And that's all that we have to do. Except we do need to reference this script file in our HTML. And I'm going to do that at the very bottom of the body of our document. Because, and this is very important, We are working with elements within our JavaScript. If those elements are not loaded in the browser, then we are going to run into some issues. So if we put our JavaScript code at the very bottom of the document, we pretty much ensure that the elements that we are going to work with, that is the control bar, the sidebar, and the main content, those are loaded so we won't have any issues there. So in order to add JavaScript to our HTML, we use a script element. And script elements have to have a closing tag. If you remember, whenever we referenced a style sheet, we used a self-closing tag. We can't do that with a script. We have to have an opening tag and a closing tag. Now, if we didn't have an external JavaScript file, we could just put our JavaScript in here. But since we have an external file, we want to pull that in. We use the source attribute, and then we set the value of that attribute to the name of our JavaScript file, toggle-sidebar. And then we save it and we run it in the browser. So whenever we go to the browser, let's refresh. Whenever we click on toggle sidebar, it should remove the sidebar and the content fills the entire browser. And whenever we click on toggle sidebar again, everything is restored. Now, I'm well aware that if you are brand new to JavaScript, if this is your first experience, you're probably scratching your head wondering what's going on. And I can empathize because I've been there and everybody else has been there as well. But once again, my goal wasn't to teach you JavaScript. It was to show how we can use JavaScript to manipulate the things within our page. And I would say that this just scratches the surface of what you can do with JavaScript, but that really doesn't do it justice because the surface is rather thick. We haven't really scratched anything. Before I leave you, there are a few things that I hope you take away from this course. First, I hope you have a better understanding of how the web works in general. In the first few lessons, you learned about networks, DNS, HTTP, and the web server. Now, you won't use all of that information all of the time. In fact, you won't even have to think much about IP addresses and DNS unless if you are responsible for setting them up. But you at least have an idea of how they work. Second, I want to re-emphasize the relationship between the technologies that we use to create web pages. Today's web pages are written with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We use HTML to add structure to our documents because without it, we would have just a jumbled mess of text. And while HTML used to have the ability to add style to our pages, we now use CSS for that purpose. By using selectors, we can apply style to our HTML elements and even change the layout of the page without modifying our markup. And then there's JavaScript. We use it to find elements within our page, modify the markup on the fly, and change the style applied to our document. It is an incredibly powerful language. No wonder it's the most popular programming language on earth. Thank you so much for watching this course. Please feel free to get in contact with me through Twitter or the Tuts Plus forums if you have any questions. Once again, thank you, and I will see you next time.